March 15, 1945. A classified American military order was issued that would render Japan's most impenetrable concrete bunkers completely useless within weeks, using a weapon so devastating that its existence was buried in classified files for decades. This wasn't the atomic bomb, napalm, or any conventional explosive. It was something far more ingenious that turned Japan's greatest defensive advantage into their biggest weakness. But what could possibly make reinforced concrete bunkers simply collapse on themselves? And why did the U.S. military want this weapon erased from history?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. March 1945. The war was almost over, but nobody told the men inside the concrete bunkers scattered across the Pacific Islands. For 3 long years, Japan had been losing ground to the Americans. Island after island fell. Ships burned in harbors. Cities turned to ash under the endless bombing runs. But here, deep inside these massive concrete fortresses, Japanese soldiers still believed they could win. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his eye to the narrow slit in the bunker wall. Outside, palm trees swayed in the warm breeze. The ocean sparkled blue under the morning sun. It looked peaceful, but Hiroshi knew better. Somewhere out there, American ships waited. American planes circled. American soldiers prepared for another attack. The bunker around him was a masterpiece of engineering. The walls were 6 feet thick, made of reinforced concrete and steel. The ceiling could take a direct hit from the biggest bombs. Underground tunnels connected this bunker to dozens of others across the island. Inside these tunnels, they stored food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. The Japanese had spent 2 years building this fortress. They called it impregnable. Nothing could break it. Hiroshi had been here for 8 months. Before the war, he had been a teacher in Tokyo. He taught children about honor, duty, and love for the emperor. Now he taught young soldiers how to die with dignity. The boys under his command were barely 18 years old. Their faces were thin from hunger. Their uniforms hung loose on their shrinking bodies, but their eyes still burned with determination. The radio crackled in the corner. News from the home islands is always bad these days. Tokyo bombed again, Yokohama in flames, Osaka evacuated. The Americans were getting closer to Japan itself. But here in the bunkers, they would make the enemy pay for every inch of ground. Private Kenji Sato cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. His hands shook slightly as he worked. Not from fear, he told himself, but from hunger. The rice rations had been cut again last week. Now each man got only 1 bowl per day. Sometimes they mixed it with seaweed or grass to make it last longer. The taste was terrible, but it kept them alive. Kenji remembered his mother's cooking. Hot meals with fish, vegetables, and plenty of rice. His stomach cramped just thinking about it. When was the last time he had eaten meat? Christmas? Maybe earlier. Time blurred together in the bunker. Day and night meant nothing when you lived underground. The concrete walls around them had become their world. In the morning, they stood watch. In the afternoon, they maintained their weapons. In the evening, they wrote letters home that would never be sent. The mail boats stopped coming months ago, but writing helped them remember who they were before the war. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. Hiroshi grabbed his binoculars and looked through the observation slit. An American landing craft approached the beach. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. The men inside looked different than the Japanese soldiers. They were bigger, healthier. Their uniforms fit properly. Their equipment looked new and well-maintained. Something else caught Hiroshi's attention. Mixed in with the regular landing craft were strange new vessels he had never seen before. They looked like cargo ships, but smaller. Men in different uniforms worked on their decks. These weren't Marines or Army soldiers. They wore white coats like scientists or doctors. What were they doing here? The radio operator called out. He had intercepted an American transmission. The message was coded, but one word came through clearly. Project. The Americans were talking about some kind of project. Then another word. Collapse. The transmission cut out before they could hear more. Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. In all his months of fighting the Americans, he had learned to respect their weapons. Their planes were fast and deadly, their ships carried enormous guns, their soldiers had unlimited ammunition. But they fought like soldiers. They used bombs and bullets and artillery, things you could see coming, things you could defend against. This felt different. The strange ships, the men in white coats, the coded messages about collapse. What kind of weapon could make things collapse? Hiroshi had seen American bombers drop 1,000-pound explosives on these bunkers. The concrete barely cracked. What could be worse than that? Private Sato stopped cleaning his rifle. He was staring at the wall with wide eyes. A thin crack had appeared in the concrete near the ceiling. It had not been there yesterday. Hiroshi was sure of that. He inspected every inch of their fortress daily. The crack was small, maybe 6 inches long, but it was definitely new. More cracks appeared over the next hour, tiny spider webs spreading across the walls. The concrete was strong. It had survived months of bombing. So why was it suddenly showing damage now? The Americans had not even started their attack yet.
The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. Not the sharp shock of explosions, but a steady, rhythmic pulse, like a giant heartbeat coming from deep underground. The vibrations grew stronger. Dust fell from the ceiling. The crack near the ceiling grew longer. Hiroshi grabbed the radio. He needed to warn the other bunkers, but when he tried to call them, he got only static. Something was jamming their communications, or worse. Maybe the other bunkers were no longer there to answer. The vibrations stopped as suddenly as they started. For a moment, the bunker fell completely silent. Then Hiroshi heard something that made his blood freeze. Water. Dripping water somewhere behind the walls. That was impossible. This bunker sat on solid rock, 50 feet above the ocean. There were no water pipes, no underground springs. So where was the water coming from? Private Sato found the source first. A thin stream of seawater trickled from a crack near the floor. The crack had not been there an hour ago. Now it was wide enough to fit a finger inside. The water tasted salty when Sato touched his tongue. Ocean water. But how could ocean water reach them here? More water appeared in different places. First just drops, then steady streams. The concrete floor began to puddle. Hiroshi knelt down and studied the cracks more closely. They were not random. They followed straight lines, like someone had drawn them with a ruler. These were not battle damage. This was something else entirely. The radio crackled to life. A voice speaking Japanese came through the static. But it was wrong somehow. The words were correct, but the accent was American. Someone was reading from a script, trying to sound Japanese. The message was simple. Surrender now. Evacuate your positions. Your bunkers will collapse in 6 hours. Hiroshi laughed. It had to be propaganda, American psychological warfare. They wanted the Japanese to believe some imaginary superweapon could destroy their fortress. But concrete and steel did not just collapse. These bunkers had been built to last forever. Then he heard the screaming. It came from Bunker 7, 200 yards to the east. Hiroshi grabbed his binoculars and looked through the observation slit. He could see the entrance to Bunker 7 clearly. Smoke poured from the opening, not the black smoke of explosions, but white steam like boiling water. Men stumbled out of the entrance, coughing and gasping. Their uniforms were soaked. Some of them were burned. The radio operator tried to contact Bunker 7. No response.
He tried Bunker 4 to the north. No response. One by one, he called every position on the island. The radio stayed silent. Either their communications were completely jammed, or there was nobody left to answer. A new sound filled the air. Not explosions or gunfire, but a deep rumbling noise, like thunder that never stopped. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the ground, from the walls, from the ceiling above their heads. The sound grew louder every minute.
Hiroshi sent Private Sato to check the ammunition storage room. The boy returned 5 minutes later, his face white with fear. The steel door to the storage room had buckled. The walls around it bulged outward like balloons ready to burst. Inside, boxes of ammunition floated in 3 feet of seawater. The carefully sealed room had somehow filled with ocean water in less than an hour. The water in their main chamber was rising too. It had started at ankle height. Now it reached their knees. The strange thing was the temperature. Ocean water should be cool, but this water felt warm, almost hot. Steam rose from the surface in some places. More cracks appeared every few minutes. The walls looked like broken glass, covered in spiderwebs of fractures. Some cracks were wide enough to see through to the next room. The 6-foot-thick concrete walls that had seemed so solid were falling apart like old clay pots. Private Sato pointed at the ceiling. A chunk of concrete the size of a dinner plate had fallen into the rising water. Then another piece fell, and another. The ceiling that was supposed to protect them from 1,000-pound bombs was crumbling like stale bread. Through the observation slit, Hiroshi watched the American ships offshore. They had not fired a single shot. No bombs fell from their planes. No artillery shells screamed through the air. Yet somehow, the most powerful fortress in the Pacific was destroying itself from the inside. The men in white coats worked calmly on their strange ships. They operated equipment that Hiroshi could not identify. Long metal tubes extended from their vessels down into the ocean. Cables and wires connected everything together. Whatever they were doing, it required no explosives, no violence, just science. A terrible thought entered Hiroshi's mind. What if the Americans had found a way to attack the rock itself? What if they could somehow weaken the stone foundation that held up the entire island? He had heard stories from prisoners of war, stories about American factories that made impossible things, machines that could think, weapons that had killed without bullets. Maybe this was another impossible American invention. The water reached their waists now. It was definitely getting hotter. Some of the men started removing their boots and outer clothing. The metal parts of their equipment became too hot to touch. Steam filled the bunker, making it hard to see more than a few feet. Hiroshi made a decision that went against every order he had ever received. He told his men to prepare for evacuation, not surrender, evacuation. They would leave the bunker, regroup outside, and find another way to fight. The fortress that was supposed to be their strength had become their trap. But when they tried to open the main door, it would not move. The steel frame had twisted in the heat. The door was sealed shut. They were prisoners in their own bunker, watching it slowly destroy itself around them. The water kept rising, the ceiling kept falling, and somewhere outside, American scientists in white coats continued their impossible work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rumbling sound grew louder. Through the rising steam and falling debris, Hiroshi realized they had been fighting the wrong war all along. The water reached their chests when Private Sato made the discovery that changed everything. He had been trying to find another way out, feeling along the walls in the growing darkness. His hand found something impossible. A hole in the 6-foot-thick concrete wall. Not a crack or a break, but a perfectly round hole about the size of his fist. The edges were smooth, as if the concrete had simply melted away. Hiroshi pressed his eye to the hole and looked outside. What he saw made no sense at all. The ground around their bunker was not solid rock anymore. It looked like thick mud or wet cement. Steam rose from the surface. Palm trees that had stood for decades were sinking slowly into the earth as if the island itself was dissolving. More holes appeared in the walls every few minutes, always perfectly round, always with smooth edges. The concrete was not breaking or exploding, it was disappearing. Atom by atom, molecule by molecule, the strongest fortress in the Pacific was being eaten away by something invisible. Through the largest hole, Hiroshi could see American soldiers standing on solid ground just 50 yards away. They wore special suits that covered their entire bodies. Masks protected their faces. They watched the Japanese bunkers with calm, scientific interest, like doctors observing an experiment. There was no hate in their faces, no anger, no fear, just professional curiosity. One American soldier held a strange device that clicked rapidly. Hiroshi had heard that sound before, in school, when his science teacher demonstrated a radiation detector. The clicking meant invisible energy was in the air. Energy that could kill just as surely as bullets, but much more slowly. The truth hit Hiroshi like a physical blow. The Americans had not built a weapon to destroy bunkers. They had built a weapon to destroy the very atoms that made up the concrete and steel. They had found a way to make solid matter simply stop being solid. It was not chemistry or engineering. It was something beyond normal science. Something that made the atomic bomb look like a children's toy. The water around them was not just seawater anymore. It glowed faintly in the darkness. The glow was beautiful, like moonlight on snow, but Hiroshi knew that beauty meant death. They were standing in radioactive water, breathing radioactive steam, surrounded by concrete that was radioactive as it dissolved around them.
His mind struggled to understand what this meant. For 3 years, Japan had told its people that American technology was inferior. American soldiers were weak and cowardly. American industry made cheap, breakable products. But what kind of science could turn solid rock into mud? What kind of mind could imagine a weapon that attacked the very building blocks of matter? Private Sato was writing in his diary with a pencil stub. His handwriting shook as the water rose to his neck. He wrote about his mother, his village, the cherry blossoms that would bloom next spring. Then he stopped writing and looked at Hiroshi with eyes that seemed much older than his 18 years. The boy spoke in a whisper that somehow carried through the steam and noise. He said that everything they had been taught was wrong. The Americans were not inferior. They were so far ahead of Japan that it was like comparing a steam engine to a horse-drawn cart. This weapon proved that America could reshape reality itself. Hiroshi felt something crack inside his chest, not his ribs, but something deeper. His faith, his certainty, his understanding of the world. For 30 years he had believed that the Japanese spirit could overcome any obstacle, that honor and determination were stronger than technology, that dying with dignity was more important than living with defeat. But what dignity was there in being dissolved alive by invisible forces? What honor was there in fighting an enemy who could unmake the very atoms of your fortress? The Americans had not just built a better weapon, they had rewritten the rules of war itself. The concrete ceiling above their heads was now full of holes. Through them, Hiroshi could see the night sky. Stars twinkled peacefully overhead, completely unaware that the laws of physics were being broken just below them. The sight was so normal, so beautiful, that it made the horror around them even more unreal. Water reached their necks. The remaining air in the bunker was thick with radioactive steam. Most of the walls had dissolved completely. Only the steel framework remained, twisted and glowing in the strange light. Their underground fortress had become an underwater cage. Hiroshi thought about his students back in Tokyo, children he had taught to love their country, to trust their leaders, to believe that Japan could never be defeated. What would he tell them now? How do you explain to a child that everything their parents and teachers said was wrong, that their entire nation had been living in a dream while their enemies learned to control the forces of creation itself? He understood now why the American soldiers looked so calm. They were not fighting a war. They were conducting a science experiment. Japan was not their enemy. Japan was their laboratory specimen, a chance to test weapons that could reshape the world.
The water covered their mouths. In the last moments before it covered their heads completely, Hiroshi had one final thought. The Americans had not just won this war. They had moved beyond war into something else entirely. Something that made old ideas about honor, courage, and national spirit seem as ancient as wooden swords. Private Sato's diary floated past him in the glowing water, its pages dissolving like everything else. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka opened his eyes to white ceiling tiles and the smell of clean sheets. For a moment, he thought he was dead. The last thing he remembered was radioactive water closing over his head in the collapsing bunker. But dead men did not feel the softness of real mattresses or hear the gentle hum of electric fans. An American doctor stood beside his bed, checking numbers on a metal chart. The man spoke broken Japanese, but his meaning was clear. Hiroshi had been rescued from the ruins of his fortress. He was now a prisoner of war in an American military hospital. The date was August 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Over the following weeks, Hiroshi learned what had happened to his bunker. The Americans called it Operation Deep Strike. They had used controlled nuclear reactions to weaken the molecular bonds in concrete and steel. Not enough radiation to kill immediately, but enough to make solid matter behave like liquid. It was a demonstration, they said, a warning of what total war could look like in the atomic age. The American guards treated him with strange kindness. They brought him books to read, paper to write letters, and food that seemed impossible after years of starvation. Real meat, fresh vegetables, white bread and butter. The portions were so large that Hiroshi could not finish them. When he asked why they were wasting so much food on a prisoner, the guards looked confused. This was normal food, they said, regular portions for regular people. A young American officer visited him every few days. The man had studied in Tokyo before the war and spoke perfect Japanese. He explained things that Hiroshi found hard to believe. American factories produced enough food to feed the entire world. American farms grew more rice in one state than all of Japan combined. American scientists had been working on atomic weapons for years, not months. The bunker destroyer was just one of dozens of secret projects. What shocked Hiroshi most was learning about American prisoners in Japan. The officer showed him photographs of Allied soldiers in Japanese camps, skeletons covered with skin, men who weighed less than children, torture marks and infected wounds. The contrast was so stark that Hiroshi felt sick looking at the images. He thought about the rice rations in his bunker, 1 bowl per day mixed with grass and seaweed. He had believed this was normal wartime sacrifice, but these American prisoners showed him what real starvation looked like. His people had been hungry, but these men had been systematically murdered through neglect. The hospital had a library filled with American magazines and newspapers. Hiroshi spent hours studying photographs of American cities, factories, and farms. He saw pictures of ordinary families eating meals that would have fed his entire unit for days. He saw factories bigger than entire Japanese cities, producing tanks and planes faster than Japan could destroy them. December 1945.
Hiroshi stood on the deck of an American transport ship, watching the coast of Japan grow larger on the horizon. He carried with him a small bag of possessions given to him by his captors: a warm coat, canned food, medicine, and a letter of introduction written in Japanese explaining his situation. The port city of Yokohama was barely recognizable. Entire districts had been flattened by bombing. People lived in shacks made from scrap metal and burnt wood. Children begged American soldiers for chocolate and cigarettes. The smell of smoke and sewage filled the air. Hiroshi took a train toward Tokyo, paying with American dollars that seemed like play money to the conductor. Through the window, he saw endless miles of destruction. Cities reduced to ash, factories reduced to twisted metal, rice fields turned into refugee camps. This was what total war looked like when fought against an enemy who could reshape matter itself. His family home in Tokyo was gone. A crater marked the spot where it had stood. Neighbors told him his parents had died in the March firebombing. His sister had moved to Osaka with her children. His students were scattered to the winds, if they were still alive at all. Hiroshi found work teaching English to Japanese businessmen who needed to communicate with the American occupation forces. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had once taught children to die for the emperor now taught adults to live in the American world. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself using American money, American technology, and American ideas. The students who came to his English classes spoke eagerly about American movies, American music, and American democracy. They had no memory of the old Japan, the Japan that believed spirit could overcome science. In 1955, 10 years after the war ended, Hiroshi stood in his small apartment in Tokyo, looking out at a city full of electric lights and modern buildings. On his desk was a letter from the American officer who had visited him in the hospital. The man was now a professor at an American university. He had included a photograph of himself with his wife and children standing in front of a house that looked like a palace to Hiroshi's eyes. Hiroshi sat down and began writing his response. He wanted to tell the American about the lesson he had learned in that hospital, in that bunker, in those final moments when solid matter became liquid around him. The lesson was not about weapons or technology or even war. The lesson was about truth. For his entire life, he had believed in a version of reality that was simply wrong. Wrong about America, wrong about Japan, wrong about the nature of power in the modern world. The bunker weapon had not just dissolved concrete and steel. It had dissolved the illusions that kept an entire nation blind to its own limitations. He ended his letter with a single sentence that summed up everything he had learned. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who can destroy your body, but the one who can prove that everything you believed about the world was wrong. 30 years later, in 1985, an old man named Hiroshi Tanaka sat in a university lecture hall in Tokyo. Gray-haired students filled the seats around him. These were not children learning English for business deals. These were graduate students studying history, trying to understand how their grandparents' generation had believed such impossible things. Hiroshi had become something he never expected, a witness. One of the last people alive who had seen the secret weapon that ended the Pacific War. The American government had finally declassified some documents about Operation Deep Strike. Historians wanted to interview him. Documentary filmmakers requested his story, but most people still did not believe it was real. The professor at the front of the classroom held up a photograph. It showed the remains of Hiroshi's bunker, taken 3 days after the weapon was used. Where 6 feet of reinforced concrete at once stood, only twisted metal skeleton remained. The concrete had simply vanished, as if it had never existed at all. A young student raised her hand. She asked the question that everyone wanted to know. Why had America kept this weapon secret for so long?
Why not use it to end wars quickly and save lives? Why hide technology that could reshape the world? Hiroshi stood up slowly, his joints creaking after decades of carrying the weight of what he had seen. The classroom fell silent. Everyone knew his story. The teacher who had watched his fortress dissolve around him. The prisoner who had learned that everything his nation believed was wrong. He told them the answer that had taken him 40 years to understand. The Americans had not kept the weapon secret to hide their power. They had kept it secret to hide their mercy. A nation that could dissolve matter itself, that could reshape the atoms of reality, had chosen to use conventional bombs instead. They could have ended the war in 1943 by dissolving every building in Japan. Instead, they had fought island by island, losing hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers, because they wanted to defeat Japan without destroying the Japanese people entirely. The secret weapon was not just about science, it was about restraint, about a kind of power so complete that its owners could afford to be gentle. The most terrifying thing about America was not that they could unmake matter itself. The most terrifying thing was that they chose not to. Hiroshi walked home through the streets of modern Tokyo, past buildings made with American steel and American concrete. His city was alive and prosperous because his former enemies had possessed the wisdom to limit their own terrible capabilities. The bunkers that had seemed so strong were nothing compared to the strength required to stop yourself from using a weapon that could end the world. He had spent his life teaching others the lesson written in radioactive water and dissolved concrete. Power without wisdom is destruction, but wisdom without power is helpless. The secret weapon had taught America both sides of that truth. They had learned to dissolve matter and chosen to build instead. That night, Hiroshi wrote his final letter to his old American friend. Tomorrow, he would mail it to a university in California, where a retired professor still wondered about the Japanese soldier he had met in a hospital 40 years ago. The letter contained only one sentence, the same truth he had been trying to express since 1945. The weapon that made our bunkers collapse was not made of atoms or energy, but of something far more powerful. It was made of a nation that had learned the difference between what they could do and what they should do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.